Our project was on the anti-vaccination movement's effect on world health. I'm Michelle, this is Natalie, and this is Reed. So our question in particular that our research addressed was, how does anti-vaccination ideology affect the spread of disease? And as I'm sure if any of you guys have been on social media or on the news or even through something like a meme, you know that there's a concern with measles. So we decided to focus particularly on measles and decided to model this through MATLAB. Along the way, we're going to address a few other questions, including what happens if the unvaccinated population is randomly distributed, what if the unvaccinated population is in little clusters, and at what point does herd immunity fail?
So, as we said, we're modeling the spread of measles in our project, and we decided to choose measles because officially in the year 2000, measles was declared eradicated in the United States by the CDC, but recently, especially starting in December 2018, there's been major outbreaks in different places. I know there was a major one in New York, I think there's been some in California. So really since the past 6 months, starting at the beginning of the year, the number of cases of measles has drastically increased throughout the United States, which is why we chose it to model it in our project.
So before we start talking about the model, let's go over some terminology. So this is an SIR model that we're using. So it stands for susceptible, infected, and recovered. So susceptible are people who are not vaccinated and susceptible to the disease. Infected are obviously the ones infected with measles. And recovered are individuals that are either recovered or dead. Also, extremists are individuals who are very strongly anti-vax ideals. So before we got into making the model, we did some research both on measles and on MMR. So when we looked at the physical spread of disease, we found that measles is contagious for approximately 8 days, and symptoms appear 7 to 14 days after infection. So that's not 7 to 14 days of after you start being contagious, because it takes a little while before you're contagious. It's actually about 4 days that you're contagious before you see these symptoms. So measles is also spread through coughing and sneezing, and it lives in the airspace for up to 2 hours. And lastly, the vaccine is only 97% effective. We also looked at the idea spread models that look at that. We found that anti-vaxxers are a lot more active on social media than pro-vaxxers. We also found that the silencing phenomenon is present in person-to-person contact. So this is when a person does not voice their opinions for fear of social isolation. We also saw that online the echo chamber takes effect, and this is prevalent on social media platforms where they'll see what your ideas are, and then they'll show you more content related to that. Between an interaction between the physical disease and the idea spread, we saw that there's a higher risk of outbreak when there's fewer extremists. So this sounds kind of weird, but it's because when there's fewer extremists, it means the anti-vax people are more clustered together, which leads to a higher risk for outbreak. And we also know that network analysis might be a more accurate way to show this, but it requires a lot of data, so it sacrifices generability.
So we decided to create an agent-based model, and the basis of an agent-based model is basically a network of nodes connected by edges, where in our case each node is a person, and they can have different statuses such as being susceptible, infective, recovered, vaccinated, and then through the edges, things like the disease are spread, but also, as you see later in the model, ideas through social media. So to create a basic connection between our nodes, we started with a basic network where each node is connected to the 4 nodes around it, directly above and directly below and directly to the left and right. And we created these connections using an adjacency matrix, which is where all the 1s represent connections and all the 0s represent where there is no connection. So you can see with node E is highlighted, you can see on the adjacency matrix where the corresponding connections lie. And in our later model, we decided to split up the connections between a weekday status and a weekend status. And during the weekday, all the general nodes are divided by age group, starting between like 0 to 5, and then 5 to 18, 18 to 25, 25 to around 65. And you're connected to the 8 nodes around you on the weekday. That symbolizes like you're at school, you're around a lot more people, you're at work, you're generally around people more your age and interacting with more people. And we use the 4-connection network to show weekends, and it's just the people that are closest to you, like your close friends that you're with on the weekends, or just your family. So you're not interacting with as many people, but it's just the people you're locally surrounded by.
So to kind of introduce how our plots are set up, so we have n numbers of nodes on each axis, which gives us an n by n plot or n squared plot. And so this is where the nodes are placed is the physical location on the weekend. So like we talked about, on the weekdays it's different, you're around people your age more, but on the weekends you're closer to like family, so the people closest to you physically. And the graphs that we're going to use here are going to be 30 by 30, so 900 individuals. So the way we spread our disease was we went node by node throughout the graph, and we first checked to see if it was infected. If not, we moved on to the next one. If it was, we said, okay, has it been 8 days that it's been infected? If not, again, we just moved. If it has not been, then we move on. If it has been, then we change it to recovered. So if it's not been 8 days, then we look at the surrounding nodes and see if they're susceptible or vaccinated. If not, again, move on. If they are, then if the node is susceptible that's next to it, it's got a 90% chance of being infected. If it's vaccinated and it's next to it, it has a 3% chance of being infected. And then we save these new statuses and we move on to the next node.
All right, so after building the basic network, just nodes and connections, we modeled a simpler spread of disease with equal rates of susceptibility and vaccination, which is not necessarily realistic to our population, but a good way just to check if our model is actually spreading measles correctly. So as you can see, measles spread pretty significantly from day 1 to day 8, and that's because one, the nodes that started infected would not recover at this point in time in the coding, and the amount of vulnerable nodes was just so significant that the 90% contact rate was just ridiculous. So to make this a little bit more realistic, we introduced the correct ratio of population. So this is about a 90% vaccinated rate. And as you can see, measles had a much harder time spreading in this population just because they were so gridlocked between other vaccinated individuals. Unfortunately, this is still not particularly realistic because individuals who are anti-vax and refuse to vaccinate their children tend to be of particular religious or other philosophical inklings, and tend to group together in clusters. So we went on to the next model, which was the introduction of extremists and recovery, where you can see these little diamonds, which represent like people who spearhead the anti-vaccination movement. And you can see in this model that it spreads a little bit more than the last, just because you do have these clusters that put susceptible people close to infected people, so it's going to spread.
So here's one of our models that's just the physical spread of disease. So you can see, again, these clusters around extremists. You can see there's a good amount of infected individuals, not as many susceptible or recovered, and then, of course, a whole lot of people that are vaccinated. A week later, you can see that the individuals that were infected in the first place have now become recovered, and they've also spread the disease to surrounding nodes. And then a week later, you can see that all the infected individuals are gone, So we know that the outbreak is over and we're left with that population. And so here's a graph that shows how the percent of the population for each category goes on over time. So you can see the recovered shoots up, the infected and susceptible both shoot down. So the next thing we did was add a social media connection. So we spread these ideas, so the anti-vax or pro-vax, through a social media platform. So first off, we cut out anyone under the age of 12 because we used a Facebook as the platform, and Facebook does not let you make an account unless you're 12. And then even in the people that are 12 or older, there are still different probabilities based on age group on whether or not you had a social media account. So the nodes that were included in this weren't every single node in the entire population. It was just a select few. So we ended up spreading these ideals based on a scale of influence. So each node had an individual influence factor, which was a probability that if they came into contact with someone of a different ideals, that they might or might not take the ideal of the other person. So we started off with our initial population, and they had their ideas, and then we spread these ideas throughout the population. And this was our first generation, and so the graphs we made afterwards were the second generation. So when you get vaccinated, it's normally your parents vaccinating you because you get the MMR vaccine when you're really young. So this shows the second generation. And you can see it's a little bit more spread out because social media reaches a lot of people. And you can see there's a bit fewer extremists, and there's still a lot of infected individuals. A week later, you can see, again, a lot of people have become recovered, but they've also spread it. And then a week later, you can see that the disease is still there. And here's another graph that shows the percentage over time.
So in future work, we would like to work on including a couple different things, like incorporating a concept of families where people are really more stuck together, whether it's for their ideals or just people that you're consistently around frequently, and in a long run, running the simulation over a long period, how those ideals change over time. Also making a more dynamic system, because currently our system is fixed, so no one can enter or leave the network. So adding stuff like that, whether it's people dying, people being born, or people just coming in and out, especially since a lot of the measles cases that occur in the United States are coming in from people from another country. And then just working with the numbers, looking at what specific points in different vaccination percentages and stuff like that, that things really start to break down in communities. And also possibly including something where you'd be, once you realize you're ill, you either go to a hospital or you just kind of quarantine yourself to make you less infected to the people around you.
Thank you very much. Very nice work. Questions?
Yeah, how long does a simulation of yours take?
Like, how long is the time period?
Yeah, how long would be like on the 30 by 30 grid? How long would it take to evolve, like 1 week?
It's pretty fast. Like
yeah.
a couple seconds.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it looked like you had been starting off with lots of infected in the population. Was there a particular motivation for studying like that kind of dynamic when there's already a lot of infection versus like starting with a very few people like you had talked about having oftentimes it enters a community and like someone from outside the community and then spreads? Is there like any reason you chose to start with large amounts of infected instead of small amounts of infected?
Well, in the final model, I think like each node has like a 1 to 2% probability of starting infected. But if you wanted to, and I think we did run a simulation where we had like one single infected node and it spread. The main thing is it's just because we're dealing with people, it's already hard to get like something that's going to be super realistic. You know what I mean? So you could totally do it that way. It's just a matter of like changing the probabilities.
How did you come up with some of those probabilities? Like, for example, in your first model, you had the probability if two unvaccinated people bump into each other and one of them has it, it's a 90% transition. What was that based on?
Yeah, so there's actually a 2014 University of Michigan study that suggested that 9 out of 10 people who are unvaccinated and come in contact with measles will become infected. So that's where that number's from.
Yeah.
So in my upper level lab-based classes, I sometimes struggle between using Python or MATLAB or, can you speak to the advantages, maybe even the disadvantages of using MATLAB for these simulations?
So MATLAB has a lot of built-in functions that make it easier to plot and change colors and make functions easier. So that's why we chose it.
And MATLAB in particular is known for working really well with large matrices, and because we're running through such significantly large adjacency matrices, we decided that it would probably be good to go with a program that works with that well.
Awesome. Thank you.
In your SIR graphs, where you had the 3 different colored curves, so obviously it looks like you didn't have a graph for V, although I presume it would just be flat, right? Like everybody, people weren't changing their vaccinated status throughout the simulation, right? And then my second question, so first question is, is it true that the V is just flat? And my second question is, this is pretty spiky. Did you consider a model that, would introduce an extra parameter to be sort of closer to continuous?
So the vaccinated one, it's not exactly a straight line because they do have the probability of getting infected, especially when they come into contact with more infected individuals. So you do see a little bit of a downward trend on that. Also, it's pretty spiky because of the 8-day period. So after 8 days, they are recovered. And so once you get these large populations of infected people that suddenly become recovered, it shoots up and the infected shoots down, which makes it a lot harder for it to be like a smooth graph.
Good. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
What's the significance, in extremists in the bunch? What does that change? For their specific?
So it mostly changes that we have the clusters around them, so it just kind of makes where the clusters are. It also is more geared towards the social media aspect, so they're more set in their ideals, which means that they don't change their ideals, but they do spread them a lot. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and then in the physical spread, before we introduced the social media aspect, it was just kind of a good way to be like, all right, here's someone who's going to spearhead this particular community of people. Let's make sure that the nodes surrounding that person have a higher chance of having similar ideals.
So it seemed in all of your simulations, pretty much eventually measles went down to, and even in this graph goes down to a very small percentage. Were there any simulations you ran where a certain number of extremists or a certain number of unvaccinated nodes could just lead measles to sort of run off and not go down to such a low percentage?
Yeah, so the literature actually suggests that you have to have, depending on the literature, 85 to 95% of the population to be vaccinated for herd immunity to stand. We ran a couple simulations just kind of messing with the numbers, seeing what different things did. And I think once you got around to the 70% vaccinated rate, the amount of time that measles would stay alive really depended on the physicality of the graph generated. So in high extremists or a lot of unvaccinated and populations, it just spread a lot. And I think we went up to a month with that, and there was still at least 4 people who were still infected.
It's kind of hard to see how long this would be realistically because we don't have the immigration, the death, the moving, and everything like that. So since the population's static, it spreads really quickly. Yeah.
Great discussion. Any other questions? All right, please join me in thanking the speakers.